Hello, everybody, and welcome to the August 24th iteration of the SIG-Windows community meeting for Kubernetes. As always, these meetings are recorded and uploaded to YouTube, so be sure to adhere by the CNCF Code of Conduct. Let's jump into some announcements for today. First announcement is that KubeCon North America registration has been open for a little bit. There's a couple of details here. It's still planned to be a hybrid event, so even if you don't plan on attending virtually or in person, you can attend virtually here. There's a lot more details about how all the safety precautions that they're taking for the in-person event, if that still happens, on the page too. I'm being very cautious about that. So I encourage everybody to kind of take a look and see if you can fit in either the in-person or virtual option into your schedule. There's a couple of SIG-Windows talks. We're doing the maintainer talk, and the two topics that we're going to cover are the host process containers that we've been doing, and then the SIG-Windows dev environment that Jay and other folks have been working very hard on. And then I haven't taken a look at the full agenda, but there is a talk about how service meshes work on Windows that might be interesting to folks too. And there's a lot of other there's always a lot of other interesting talks going on. So take a look at that. Next announcement is the 123 release schedule is up. I believe they finalized this yesterday, or are saying that the start of the release is today, or is yesterday. Important deadlines that are coming up, our enhancement freeze is September 9th, which is in a little over 2 weeks. So if you're working on an enhancement, I encourage you to kind of work towards getting that that enhancement approved. Another interesting differentiation this time around is that they are the production readiness team is wanting to have a soft freeze on September 2nd. That's a group of I believe four individuals now who are reviewing pretty much all of the KEPs for production readiness criteria. So there's limited bandwidth there. So the earlier that this gets on the production readiness reviews team's radars, the better. If anybody's having trouble getting review traction from this, please let me or any of the other leads know, and we'll work towards getting that sorted out. I see that Jay added an announcement saying that Calico is now working in the Windows dev environment. That is good news. I think can definitely get. We should showcase that sometime. And yeah, Jay, we should plan on doing another demo of the SIG-Windows tools stuff at the community meeting coming up too sometime. Doesn't have to be today, but I think there's been a lot of great progress made there.
Cool. Yeah, definitely.
Does anybody have any other announcements that they'd like added or just want to announce? Now we can go into some of the discussions around KEPs coming up, which I will do. I'll talk about the host process containers first, since I think that's going to be a shorter discussion here or update here. There's a draft PR to open this up or to push this to beta in 123. As I think I've mentioned on the previous community calls, that I think most of the work in the host process containers is still going to be in outside of Kubernetes components now, but we would like to try and progress this to beta to get more, to make it easier for users to enable and give us feedback on. And then we'll see how that's happening or how that works out later. The next KEP that we had some movement on was the KEP that Ravi was working on about identifying Windows pods at API admission time. Ravi unfortunately isn't able to attend today, but I think that's important enough that we'll cover this anyway. So Ravi set up a meeting yesterday morning with a bunch of different stakeholders here. There was representation from SIG-Node, SIG-Auth, SIG-Windows, and the API server folks, and a whole bunch of other folks to discuss to settle on a method for how to identify Windows pods, at least in terms of how policy and some of the admission controllers will act on for Windows pods. So this isn't going to, this KEP is intentionally not covering like setting one kind of way that all different components in Kubernetes will identify Windows pods, because that's quite a large scope. So we've talked about this a number of times in the SIG-Windows community meetings before, and I think we were kind of going back and forth between using labels like the labels and the OS node selector and runtime classes. There were kind of some disadvantages of both of them, and what I think kind of the group kind of came to a consensus on yesterday was to finally add a new OS field on the pod spec. So that is the direction that this KEP is going to take. That new OS on the pod spec will represent the OS of the pod, and that is kind of an important differentiation because some of the topics covered in here were how do we eventually plan on or add future support for things like Linux containers on Windows, where the container OS and the host OS are different. So one thing that kind of came out of this is that Derek Carr from Signode was pretty adamant that at least for the foreseeable future, that pods in Kubernetes will all run containers of the same operating system. So the OS field on the pod spec will reflect that operating system. And there was a kind of a number of reasons why that decision was made, but the biggest one is that there's just so many unknowns about how mixed containers in the same pod would work. And without kind of going too into that now, there were just so many unknown questions that I think everybody agreed that keeping the pod as a single, representing the containers from a single OS just would like make the conversations around this easier. So there's going, I think Ravi started and is working on the KEP updates to describe what all having that OS field would mean. I think that there is, like, my personal feelings are that this is a kind of a good move for the Kubernetes community, but it might be a little bit rocky for a couple of releases after this gets introduced, because I could foresee the release or two after this OS field gets introduced, a number of different people saying, hey, like I set the OS field and the pod spec and I'm seeing this strange behavior because this one, these components in Kubernetes or these kind of sub-projects aren't looking at this yet. So how do we, like, just some fallout from that. So it might be a couple of releases until all of the different Kubernetes components and everything are kind of using the same OS pod spec, or the OS field on the pod spec to identify the pods. That's probably all I'm going to say on this right now. But I definitely want to open this up for another set of discussion, or like right now. I won't go too much more into the details of what was discussed at that meeting because people can kind of review all of the updates in the KEP. But if anybody has any comments, concerns, thoughts, please go ahead and let's talk about it.
Yeah, Mark, my biggest concern as I was listening to that meeting yesterday was that it's exactly what you said. I think folks, once they see this field, they're going to set the field and not set the node selector or anything else, and then wonder why their pod didn't land correctly. So something for us to watch out for, or make sure that we clearly call this out in the docs. But yes, the other thing I was thinking about is the reason we reached this wanting to have a way to identify pods was because of some work that was happening in PSP land, and that was going to break Windows if they don't take Windows into account. Now, but we forgot to discuss that, I feel, in the meeting. So is this all going to line up, or is there going to be a window where we might kind of like Windows pods might get a little screwed?
No, I think that is all going to line up. So Jordan Liggett, who was on the call yesterday, he is one of the main kind of people driving that new pod security admission stuff forward. So he's been working very closely with Ravi on making sure that this KEP specifically addresses all of those concerns. So what Arvind was mentioning was there in 122 the replacement for pod security policy went into an alpha state, and I believe the name for that is just the pod security admission. So that's a new built-in set of like admission controller that can be enabled that will enforce policies for pods coming in. The especially with the host process containers and just as Windows containers have been evolved, there's more and more kind of differences in how policy needs to be enforced for Windows and Linux containers. And the alpha implementation of that pod security admission kind of punted trying to figure that out. So the ask from the folks who were driving that was that SIG-Windows work with SIG-Node and all the other stakeholders to figure out how to solve that problem, how to identify Windows pods. That's where this KEP was born, or that was one of the motivating factors for creating this KEP. And so yes, this does help I address that. And that is one of the takeaways from the meeting yesterday too, was that, and this is also reflected in the concerns that Arvind and I just had, is that as of right now, I don't think that there's any plans, at least for the first, or for like an alpha implementation of this KEP, to have the scheduler be aware of that OS field. That OS field is specifically to have policies and different admission components in the API server be able to identify if the pod is for Windows or not, and do whatever checks it needs, and then block admission of the pod to the cluster. So one other kind of area of discussion that happened during this was what's the default behavior going to be for this new OS pod spec field? There was a little bit of discussion, and I think pretty quick consensus that there will be no default for this OS pod spec field. Well, the default will be an undefined value. And that would be to support like backwards compatibility for pod specs and across, deployments for pod specs that are targeting clusters older than whenever this lands, which is hopefully at 123. So because there's not going to be any defaulting there, the default to Linux, which I think is the right move, because otherwise everybody would need to update their pod spec immediately to be able to deploy into a 123, 124 cluster. Because there is no default value, the scheduler can be maybe influenced by this, but should not take this as authoritative. So that's kind of where that stands for the defaulting. And if the scheduler is not taking this pod spec field into consideration, you can really assume that most of the other components in Kubernetes are not going to as well.
So Mark, are there any plans to at some point make it default? Or
yes, that is kind of being, I don't think that there's any plans to make it be to default it. There may be plans to make it be required in the future. So in some version of Kubernetes, they'll like one of the checks to admit the pod will be, is this field set, just like metadata like the pod name and a couple of other fields.
I see. Yeah, and we should be careful when we do that, right? Like we should give enough time, because it's going to potentially break a lot of existing clusters.
Yeah, yes. Everybody who was discussing this was kind of very cognizant of all of the implications that either defaulting or requiring this field would set. So, but I totally agree. Yep, I think that Ravi is still making a couple of last final updates to the KEP, but anybody who's interested, please take a look. This is going to be big and potentially destabilizing for a very short time. The good news is that like all of the pod security admission stuff is not really on by default, and when it will be at levels, like at kind of security levels that don't actively block pods. So most clusters won't see an impact here when that goes when the pod security mission features go to beta until they actually start using it. And at that case, or at that point, then they should have a good understanding of how all of these components work and be able to kind of turn that on without having any issues. James, you were in that discussion too. Is there anything else that you think was discussed that would be worth noting here?
I think you covered pretty well. The one thing, like once we add a new field, then we can start to, begin to reject things at the mission time based on whether or not it's Windows or Linux. There's a lot of things that are in the security context that are specific to either one, and some of them are overlapping. And I think that that's something that is probably won't happen in the first round of this, but it is probably a good value add for having this value added to the OS spec or the pod spec.
Yeah, and once the field is there, more and more components can start acting on it, especially after it's been baked in for long enough that it's either expected or required that pod specs have that field set. Okay, I added this agenda item. There is a discussion going on right now in the community about what the optimal length for code freeze should, or for the coding duration should be. That I encourage everybody to chime in on if they're interested in this. So I believe that the 123 milestone has a 4-week gap between enhancement and code freeze. And there are a lot of folks who are saying that that's generally not enough time to, like 4 weeks is a pretty short coding milestone for a 4-month development cycle. People would argue that development and coding can actually happen before then and is encouraged to do so for prototypes and kind of other exploratory work, and that 4 weeks is really for getting high quality reviews and integration.
Mark, it may be helpful.
Yep.
It may be helpful for others and probably me forgetting what code freeze are we talking about. So what is this code freeze?
They're just discussing for each milestone of the Kubernetes, like for each Kubernetes release, how long should code, or should the coding portion of that release be? Today, let's double check. So if we look at the schedule here, enhancement freeze is September 9th, and then did they not list?
Oh yeah, the code freeze, it is down there, November 16th.
Okay. Which seems like it's more than 4 weeks. Looks like yeah, that's more than 4 weeks. So I'm not sure where that 4 weeks came from.
So the code freeze is from the beginning of enhancement freeze until you can put in the code. Is that what the code freeze is?
Yes,
or the 4
I think
weeks?
that's
Okay.
what that issue is discussing, is how long should that be?
I think it's probably 4 weeks until the release.
Oh, okay. I read that.
I think it's
wrong.
about December 7th. Yeah.
Okay, so I guess this is, yeah, all of the different dates are kind of being discussed in there, but yeah, it's basically like, where should code freeze be for any given release? Should it be earlier in the release to give more time for stabilization and test freeze, or should it be later in the release to give more time to get implementation PRs or just other PRs merged? What's kind of the sweet spot to make everybody happy with that? So some of the discussions in there, or that were discussed in kind of conversations that led up to that issue being created, were that in previous releases, having code freeze very near the end of the release didn't actually help kind of spread out the load of reviews, and they still saw all of, like, a majority of the code PRs land very close to the code freeze. So some folks are saying, because there's kind of a history of that happening, we should have code freeze be earlier to give more time for stabilization, because folks tend to work just do most of the work near the deadlines. If you're interested in that, or if you've been impacted by kind of having PRs slip because of either not getting review bandwidth or the code freeze period being the code freeze being too early in a milestone, feel free to comment on that issue. Right. That's all I see on the agenda today. Does anybody have anything else they'd like to talk about? Should we go into the pairing session a bit early? I'll leave it up to you guys.
Well, I just wanted to say thanks to everyone for doing the work on the Windows pod admission stuff. I haven't been like participating in that, but it's super important because I hit a bug every day. Today I hit a CSI bug, and I was like, well, what's the right way to do this? We've got taints, and we got to change the way we do. And so it's like I'm really excited to see something that's not so bespoke in terms of how we define things that are Windows and things that are not.
Yeah, next time Ravi is on the call, I want to give him a huge thank you for driving this. He's been kind of in a lot of conversations, both in the KEP and offline with folks. And this is a very kind of cross-cutting feature enhancement and sometimes it's difficult to get consensus across so many different SIGs. So he's been putting in a lot of very important work into this. All right, I'm going to stop the recording and hand it over to Jay then. Thanks everybody for attending.
Cool, thanks. Let's see who's here. I don't see, let's see, I see, actually a few people. I see a Meme and Friedrich both. They're probably sticking around. Let's see who else decides to stick around. Claudio, let's see if we get Claudio today.
Yeah, it's gonna be the SIG testing meeting today, so not really.
Oh, he's leaving us.
I'm gonna check the SIG node schedule
That's
or
fine.
the agenda.
It looks like, are we still recording? Did you stop recording?
No, I stopped screen share.